During the 2025 Monaco Grand Prix, Lewis Hamilton was 3 seconds behind Max Verstappen when he spotted something in the crowd that made his blood run cold. In that split second, the 7-time world champion had to make an impossible choice: win the most prestigious race in Formula One, or risk everything to prevent a tragedy that had been waiting to happen for 20 years. What he saw that day didn't just stop a race. It uncovered a mystery 2 decades in the making, a marshal's final warning, a child's desperate mission, and a champion's courage to listen when it mattered most. This is the story of how a single moment changed Formula One forever, and why sometimes the biggest victories come from choosing not to win at all. The roar of engines filled the air as Lewis Hamilton gripped his steering wheel tighter. The Monaco Grand Prix was the race every driver dreamed of winning, and he was just 3 seconds behind Max Verstappen. The narrow streets felt even tighter today, with fans packed into every possible viewing spot. Box this lap, Lewis. His race engineer's voice crackled through the radio. Lewis checked his mirrors as he approached the famous tunnel section. Everything looked normal, just like the thousands of laps he'd driven here before. But something felt different. The Mercedes engine hummed perfectly as he followed Max through the twisting streets. The gap was getting smaller. 2.8 seconds now. Lewis could almost taste victory. This would be his 4th Monaco win if he could just find a way past the Red Bull driver. "Copy," Lewis responded, his voice steady despite his heart racing. The pit stop would be crucial. One tiny mistake could cost them everything. The Monaco crowd was bigger than ever this year. People hung from balconies, pressed against fences, and filled every grandstand. As Lewis steered through the Portier corner leading into the tunnel, a flash of movement caught his eye. Something wasn't right. He blinked hard, trying to focus. The tunnel approached fast, too fast to second-guess himself. But that thing he'd seen in the crowd, it nagged at him like a splinter in his mind. "Looking good, Lewis," his engineer said. "Max will pit next lap. This is our chance." The tunnel's darkness swallowed his car. Lewis had driven through here countless times, but today the shadows seemed deeper. That's when he noticed it again, a detail so small that anyone else would have missed it. But Lewis hadn't won 7 world championships by ignoring his instincts. His mind raced back to the conversation before the race. The young fan who'd somehow gotten into the paddock. The warning that had seemed so strange at the time. It all connected now. Light flooded his vision as he exited the tunnel. The split-second decision hit him like a physical force. Everything he'd worked for was on the line. The championship points, the victory, his legacy. "Lewis, pit confirm?" The radio crackled with urgency. The crowd rose to their feet as the silver Mercedes approached the tunnel again. They expected their hero to make his usual perfect lap. Instead, Lewis Hamilton did something no one could understand. His car drifted wide, way wide of the racing line. Behind him, other drivers had to react quickly, their cars scattering like startled birds. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Comments erupted. From the commentary box, "Hamilton's gone offline. Something's wrong with the Mercedes." But nothing was wrong with the car. Lewis had made his choice knowing exactly what it meant. As chaos erupted around him, his eyes stayed fixed on that one spot he'd noticed earlier. The spot that would change Formula One forever. "Lewis, what's happening?" His engineer's voice was tense now. "Talk to us." But Lewis couldn't explain. Not yet. The consequences of what he'd just done were already spinning out around him. Red flags waved as race control tried to make sense of the situation. Other drivers were radioing their teams, confused and angry. The mighty Mercedes sat silent now, parked off the racing line in a way that blocked half the track. Lewis kept his helmet on, his face hidden from the cameras that swarmed around him. Let them guess. Let them wonder. He knew he'd made the right choice, even if it would take time for everyone else to understand. Through his visor, he could see the young fan from earlier standing in the crowd. Their eyes met for just a moment. The child nodded once, and Lewis knew this was bigger than racing. This was about saving lives. The Monaco Grand Prix had seen many historic moments over the years, but as Lewis Hamilton sat in his car, watching the officials rush toward him, he knew this would be remembered as the most important of all. Not because of who won or lost, but because of what almost happened, and what he'd stopped. His radio crackled, one final time. Lewis. Race control wants an explanation. He took a deep breath, hands still gripping the steering wheel. They'd understand soon enough. For now, he had to trust that he'd done the right thing, just like that young fan had trusted him. The crowd's confusion turned to murmurs as emergency vehicles appeared. Nobody knew what Lewis had seen. Nobody understood why one of the greatest drivers in F1 history had just thrown away his chance at victory. But they would. Soon, everyone would know why the Monaco Grand Prix of 2025 became the race that changed Formula One forever. The race where Lewis Hamilton chose something more important than winning. All because he'd spotted something in the crowd that no one else had noticed. The red flags kept waving as officials gathered around his car. Press photographers fought for position, their cameras clicking rapidly. Social media exploded with theories and questions, but Lewis stayed silent, watching that one spot where it had all started. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest victories come from choosing not to win at all. 20 minutes before Lewis Hamilton made the decision that would change Formula One forever, he was standing in the Mercedes garage, trying to calm his nerves. Something felt off. After 15 years of racing in F1, Lewis knew better than to ignore the feeling in his gut. He'd won 7 world championships by trusting his instincts, but this was different. This wasn't about racing at all. "You okay, mate?" His race engineer appeared beside him, clipboard in hand. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Lewis forced a smile. "Just focused," he said, but his mind wandered back to the strange encounter from earlier. He'd been walking through the paddock, doing his usual pre-race routine, when a small figure darted out from behind a stack of tires. Security was usually tight at Monaco, but somehow this young fan had slipped through. Instead of asking for an autograph like most fans, the child had grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "The tunnel isn't safe," they'd whispered, eyes wide with fear. "History doesn't have to repeat itself. You'll see it when you're racing, just like they did 20 years ago." Before Lewis could ask what they meant, the child had vanished into the crowd, leaving him with a chill that wouldn't go away. "Tudiu. Minutes until garage exit," a voice called over the team radio. Lewis pulled his helmet on, trying to shake off the memory. He had a race to win. The Mercedes felt good in practice, and the team had nailed the setup for Monaco's tight corners. This was his chance to close the gap in the championship. Remember, his engineer said, "Max will probably try to build a gap early. Stay with him through the first stint. We can get him in the pits." Lewis nodded, but his mind kept drifting to the tunnel. He'd driven through it thousands of times over the years. What had the kid meant about it not being safe? The garage buzzed with last-minute preparations. Mechanics triple-checked tire pressures. Engineers studied weather radar. Everything was perfect, just like always. So why did his stomach feel like it was tied in knots? As Lewis walked toward his car, He passed a wall of photos showing every Monaco Grand Prix winner. His own face smiled back at him from several frames. But today, something caught his eye. An old black-and-white photo he'd never noticed before. It showed the tunnel section from 20 years ago. The same tunnel he'd be racing through in just a few minutes. Something about the image made him pause. Was that a crack in the... Lewis! Time to go! The call snapped him back to the present. He slid into the cockpit, muscle memory taking over as he strapped himself in. The car hummed to life around him, everything exactly as it should be. But that photo, and the child's warning, kept floating in his mind. "Radio check, Lewis," his engineer's voice crackled in his ear. Loud and clear, he responded, but his voice sounded distant even to himself. The weight of being the most successful. Black driver in F1 history usually drove him forward. Today, it felt heavier. Like the responsibility went beyond just winning races. As he pulled out of the garage, Lewis caught a glimpse of movement in his mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw the young fan again, standing in the shadows. But when he looked back, there was nobody there. The formation lap began, 20 cars weaving back and forth to warm their tires. Lewis took his place on the grid, P2 right behind Max. The perfect position to fight for the win. "Remember," his engineer said, "this is our race to lose, just like we practiced." But as the red lights came on one by one, Lewis wasn't thinking about practice. He was thinking about the tunnel, about the child's warning, about that old photo on the wall. 5 red lights glowed above him. His hand tightened on the clutch paddle. The lights went out. The race that would change everything had begun. And somewhere in the massive crowd, a young fan watched and waited, knowing that Lewis Hamilton was about to face the biggest choice of his career. This time, the victory wouldn't be measured in points or trophies. This time, the real prize was something far more important. As his car launched off the line, Lewis didn't know that in less than 20 minutes, he would spot something that would force him to choose between winning a race and saving lives. He didn't know that his legacy was about to change forever. He just knew that something wasn't right. And sometimes, that's enough. Now, as Lewis sat in his stationary car with red flags waving around him, the next few minutes played out like a movie in slow motion. The race director's voice crackled over the main radio channel. "All cars maintain position. Safety car deployed." Through his visor, Lewis could see the confusion spreading through the crowd. Phones were raised high, recording everything. Autompriki. Personnel rushed along the barriers, speaking urgently into headsets. Nobody understood why one of F1's greatest champions had just deliberately driven off the racing line. "Lewis, we need an explanation." His engineer's voice was tense. "Race control is asking what happened." He clicked his radio button but didn't speak. How could he explain what he'd seen? Would anyone believe him if he told them about the hairline crack spreading across the tunnel ceiling? About how the vibrations from 20 F1 cars at racing speed would have been enough to? His thoughts were interrupted by angry team radio messages playing over the world feed. "What is Hamilton doing?" Max's voice crackled with frustration. "He nearly caused a massive crash." "This is unacceptable," another driver chimed in. "He's lost it completely." But Lewis stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the tunnel entrance. He'd seen the same signs the young fan had warned him about. The same warning signs that had been ignored 20 years ago, leading to tragedy. Emergency vehicles were approaching now, their sirens mixing with the murmur of the confused crowd. In his mirrors, Lewis could see other drivers climbing out of their cars, gesturing angrily toward his Mercedes. His team principal's voice came. "Next, Lewis, if there's something wrong with the car, you need to tell us now." The car was perfect. That was what made his decision so hard to explain. Every system was running flawlessly when he chose to drive offline, blocking the track and forcing race control to stop the event. A safety marshal approached his car, waving for him to shut off the engine. As Lewis complied, he caught another glimpse of the young fan in the crowd. They were watching intently, their expression a mix of relief and sadness. The truth would come out soon enough. The emergency engineers would inspect the tunnel and find what he'd spotted: the structural weakness that could have turned this historic race into a tragedy. Lewis unclipped his harness but stayed in the car. Around him, the iconic Monaco street circuit had turned into a scene of confusion and speculation. TV helicopters circled overhead, their cameras zooming in on his stationary Mercedes. His phone was already buzzing in his race suit pocket. The world wanted answers. Social media would be exploding with theories. His reputation, built over years of racing excellence, hung in the balance. But none of that mattered. Because 20 years ago, someone else had noticed the danger in that tunnel. Someone else had tried to warn officials. Someone else had been ignored. The young fan's parent, a marshal who'd given their life trying to prevent a disaster that nobody believed would happen. Now, history had almost repeated itself. Almost, Lewis. His engineer tried one last time. Whatever you saw, whatever made you do this, we need to know. He reached for his radio button, finally ready to explain. But before he could speak, a shout went up from the tunnel entrance. The emergency engineers had found something. The crack was spreading. In the crowd, people began pointing at the tunnel ceiling. Phones turned from filming Lewis to capturing the growing evidence that he'd been right. His team radio erupted with new voices. Oh my God. Everyone clear the tunnel now. Full evacuation of that section. Lewis watched as understanding dawned on the faces around him. What had seemed like the actions of a driver losing control was about to be revealed as something very different. But the young fan was gone now, vanished into the crowd just as quickly as they'd appeared in the paddock earlier. Who were they really? How had they known? The answers would come soon enough. For now, Lewis Hamilton had done what champions do. He'd seen danger coming. He'd made the hard choice. He'd put lives before victory. As emergency crews swarmed the tunnel entrance, Lewis finally reached for his radio. The world was waiting for an explanation. But first, he needed to tell them about a warning from 20 years ago and the brave marshal who'd tried to prevent this day from ever coming. Sometimes the biggest victories don't come with trophies. Sometimes they come from having the courage to stop. Sometimes they come from listening to ghosts of the past. And sometimes they come from trusting a child who knew exactly what would happen if history repeated itself. The Monaco Grand Prix had stopped, but the real story was just beginning. The race steward's office at Monaco was never meant to hold this many people. Engineers in safety gear stood next to team principals in pressed shirts. Race officials huddled around screens showing footage from every angle. And in the middle of it all sat Lewis Hamilton, still in his race suit, watching them try to make sense of what had happened. "Play it again," the head steward said, pointing to the main screen. "Focus on the tunnel entrance." The footage showed Lewis's Mercedes approaching the tunnel. Everything looked normal until the last second, when his car suddenly veered off the racing line. The move that had seemed crazy at the time now looked different to everyone in the room, because they'd all seen the crack. The structural report just came in, an engineer announced, holding up his tablet. The tunnel's support system was compromised. If we'd continued racing. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Outside, the media was going crazy. Helicopters still circled the track. Reporters fought for position near the steward's office. Everyone wanted to know how Lewis Hamilton had spotted something that safety inspectors had missed. "We need your official statement," one of the stewards said to Lewis. "Start from the beginning. What made you look at that specific section of the tunnel?" Lewis closed his eyes, remembering. Should he tell them about the young fan? About the warning? Something told him not to. "Not yet." "Experience," he said instead. Something didn't feel right. The light was hitting the tunnel entrance differently than usual. The stewards exchanged looks. They knew there was more to the story. On a side screen, social media reactions scrolled past. "Hamilton saves lives at Monaco. F1 hero. How did he know? This is incredible." Remember 2005? History almost repeated. That last one caught Lewis's attention. 2005, 20 years ago. The year a young marshal had died, trying to warn people about the tunnel's condition. His phone buzzed. Another message from Toto, his team boss. "Whatever you saw, whatever you knew, we stand with you. But we need the whole story. The whole story. If only they knew." Lewis's mind flashed back to other moments in his career. Times when he'd trusted his instincts against everyone's advice. The rain in Silverstone, the tire strategy in Hungary, the safety car call in Brazil. But this was different. This wasn't about racing. This was about... A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A safety marshal entered, face pale. "You need to see this," he said, handing over a dusty folder. "We found it in the old race records. From 2005, the head steward opened the folder. Photos spilled out, old Polaroids showing the same section of tunnel. And there, in faded handwriting on the back of one photo, structural concerns noted. Request immediate inspection. Monsieur Thompson, track marshal, the date on the photo, May 22, 2005. The day before the accident. The day before Marshal Thompson died." Lewis felt his heart skip. The young fan's words echoed in his mind. History doesn't have to repeat itself. "There's more," the safety marshal said. "We found these too." He spread out a series of technical drawings. They showed the tunnel's support structure, with detailed notes about potential stress points. The exact same points where today's crack had appeared. "These were filed by Marshal Thompson," the steward said quietly. Nobody listened. The room fell silent. On the screens, footage continued to play. Lewis watched himself making the decision that had stopped history from repeating. But one question remained. How had that child known? A junior steward burst into the room. "Sir, you need to see this. We found something in the crowd footage, just before Hamilton changed course." The images on the main screen changed. Now they showed the crowd near the tunnel entrance. And there, just for a frame or two, Lewis leaned forward, his heart pounding. The young fan wasn't alone. Standing next, to them, visible for just a moment, was a figure that shouldn't have been possible. A figure wearing a marshal's uniform from 2005, but before Lewis could process what he was seeing, the footage cut out. When it came back on, both figures were gone. The investigation was just beginning. And the truth was stranger than anyone could have imagined. Night had fallen over Monaco. The crowd was gone, but the tunnel was still lit up like a Christmas tree as engineers worked to stabilize the crack. Lewis stood at the track barrier, staring at the spot where he'd made his decision hours earlier. "You saw him too, didn't you?" The voice made Lewis jump. He turned to find the young fan standing beside him, just like in the paddock that morning. But something was different now. The child's eyes looked older, carrying a weight that no kid should have to bear. "The marshal in the footage," Lewis said quietly. Marshall Thompson. The child nodded, hands gripping the barrier tight. My father. The words hit Lewis like a physical force. He looked more closely at the young fan's face, seeing features that echoed the photo from the accident report. But that's impossible, Lewis said. The accident was 20 years ago. I wasn't born when he died, the child said, still staring at the tunnel, but he left something for me. Something he knew would be needed today. From a backpack, the young fan pulled out a worn notebook. Its pages were filled with detailed drawings of the tunnel's structure, calculations, and urgent notes in Marshall. Thompson's handwriting. He knew, the child continued. He tried to tell them about the weakness in the tunnel, about how the vibrations from the new cars would eventually... That's why you warned me, Lewis finished. You found his research. The child's hands trembled slightly. I've spent years studying his notes, learning everything he knew about this track, about the dangers nobody wanted to see. Around them, the circuit was eerily quiet. In the distance, camera flashes still sparkled as media tried to get shots of the tunnel repairs. But how did you know it would be today? Lewis asked. How did you know when to warn me? The young fan opened the notebook to its last page. There, in faded ink, was a date, February 18th, 2025. He calculated it, the child whispered. He knew exactly when the structural stress would reach its breaking point. Their voice caught. He just didn't live long enough to convince anyone. Lewis felt a chill run down his spine. On the page below, the date was a series of calculations he recognized from his engineering briefings, vibration frequencies, stress factors, load-bearing limits. 20 years of races, the young fan continued. 20 years of vibrations weakening the support structure. Just like he predicted. A security guard walked past, then did a double-take. Hey, this area is restricted. But when he turned back, the young fan was gone. Only the notebook remained, sitting on the barrier where they'd been standing. Lewis grabbed it before the guard reached him. It's okay, he said, showing his paddock pass. I'm just checking something. As the guard walked away, Lewis opened the notebook again. Something fell out. An old photograph. It showed Marshall Thompson standing proudly in his marshal's uniform, one hand resting on his wife's pregnant belly. On the back was a message. To my child, sometimes being right isn't enough. Sometimes you need help from someone people will listen to. Find them. Show them. Save them. Lewis's phone buzzed. A message from his team. Press conference in 10 minutes. They want answers. He looked at the tunnel, then at the notebook in his hands. The young fan had trusted him with the truth. Now it was his turn to make people listen. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. There, in the shadows near the tunnel entrance, two figures stood watching. A child and a marshal. For just a moment, their eyes met. Marshall Thompson smiled and nodded. Then both figures faded into the darkness, leaving Lewis alone with the proof of a 20-year-old warning. The press would want answers. The team would want explanations. The fans would want to know how their hero had known what to do. But some truths are harder to tell than others. Some stories are harder to believe. And some heroes, Lewis realized, never get the credit they deserve. He clutched the notebook tighter and headed for the press room. It was time to tell the world about Marshall Thompson, about a father's love reaching across 20 years, and about a child brave enough to finish what their father had started. The truth was finally coming out, and nothing in Formula One would ever be the same. The press room was packed. Camera lights blazed as Lewis walked to the front. Marshall Thompson's notebook held tight in his hands. His team principal sat to one side, the race director to the other. But Lewis barely noticed them. His eyes were fixed on two empty seats, in the back row. "Ladies and gentlemen," the press officer began, "Lewis Hamilton will now explain the events that led to today's race stoppage." Lewis opened the notebook, its worn pages catching the camera lights. The room fell silent. 20 years ago, he began, his voice steady, a marshal named Michael Thompson tried to warn everyone about a danger in the Monaco Tunnel. Nobody listened. The next day, he died trying to prevent an accident during practice. Cameras clicked rapidly. Journalists leaned forward. "He left behind a pregnant wife," Lewis continued, "and a notebook full of calculations. Calculations that predicted exactly what would happen today." He held up the notebook, showing the detailed drawings. On the screens behind him, photos appeared. The crack in the tunnel, the stress patterns, the original warnings from 2005. "This morning, his child found me." A murmur ran through the room. Several reporters started to ask questions, but Lewis raised his hand. "Please, let me finish." He turned to a specific page in the notebook. Marshall Thompson was an engineer before becoming a marshal. He understood how vibrations from F1 cars would affect the tunnel's structure over time. He calculated that after 20 years of races, the stress would reach a critical point. On the screens, more technical data appeared. The evidence that had been found in the old race records. He predicted the exact date. February 18th, 2025. Today. The room erupted with questions. Lewis waited for quiet. His child studied his notes, learned everything about the tunnel's structure, and knew they had to warn someone. They chose me because... Lewis paused, looking at those empty seats again. "Because Michael Thompson had written about me in his last entry. He wrote that someday, F1 would have drivers who cared about more than just winning. Drivers who would listen if his child ever needed to warn them." Tears glistened in several journalists' eyes. Even the hardened motorsport reporters seemed moved. What I saw in the tunnel today was exactly what Marshall Thompson predicted. A structural failure that could have been catastrophic. But because his child was brave enough to warn me, because they trusted me with their father's research, we prevented a tragedy. The technical director stepped forward, pointing to new data on the screens. "The engineering team has confirmed everything," he announced. "The tunnel's support structure was compromised exactly as Marshall Thompson's calculations predicted. If the race had continued, he didn't need to finish." Everyone understood. Questions flew from all directions. Where is the child now? How did they get into the paddock? Why didn't anyone check Thompson's warnings before? But Lewis was watching. The back of the room, where two figures had silently taken those empty seats. The young fan nodded slowly, sitting beside a faint outline that only Lewis could see. Marshall Thompson's sacrifice 20 years ago wasn't in vain, Lewis said. His child finished what he started. They saved lives today. They're the real hero of this story. He closed the notebook gently. Sometimes the most important victories in racing aren't about speed or points. Sometimes they're about having the courage to stop, to listen, to believe. The room was completely silent now. This notebook contains 20 years of research, warnings, and a father's love for a child he never got to meet. It will be donated to the F1 Museum, along with a new safety regulation named in Marshall Thompson's honor. Lewis looked directly at the young fan. Your father would be proud. He is proud. For a moment, the outline beside the child seemed to become clearer. A marshal's uniform, a proud smile. a father's love reaching across 20 years. Then both figures were gone, leaving only the truth behind. A truth that would change motorsport forever. A truth that began with a marshal's warning, continued through his child's courage, and ended with a champion choosing to listen. The Monaco Tunnel would be made safe. Marshall Thompson's name would never be forgotten, and his child would finally find peace. Sometimes the biggest changes in sport come from the smallest moments of courage. Sometimes the most important victories aren't victories at all. 1 month later, the Monaco Tunnel looked different now. New support beams gleamed under bright lights. Engineers had reinforced every section using designs that would have made Marshall Thompson proud. But the biggest change wasn't in the structure. It was in the small bronze plaque mounted at the entrance. In memory of Marshall, Michael Thompson, his warning saved lives. His legacy changed racing 2005-2025. Lewis stood before the plaque, remembering that race day. Behind him, workers were installing the new Thompson Safety System sensors throughout the tunnel, devices that would monitor structural integrity in real time at every F1 track. It's exactly what he would have wanted. The voice came from Anna Thompson, Marshall's widow, standing beside him. In her hands, she held a copy of the safety regulations that now bore her husband's name. The Thompson Protocol, she read softly, required structural monitoring at all F1 circuits. She smiled through tears. Michael always said racing could be both fast and safe. Now it will be. The changes had come quickly after that day. Every F1 track was being inspected using Marshall's original methods. His notebook had revealed more than just the Monaco prediction. It contained safety innovations that were 20 years ahead of their time. Lewis's phone buzzed with a news alert. F1 Commission unanimously approves Thompson's safety measures. All tracks to be upgraded by 2026. Have you seen them again? Anna asked quietly. Lewis knew who she meant. The young fan, their child, and the ghostly figure of Marshall himself. He shook his head. Not since the press conference. But I think they found their peace. Their mission was complete. Anna nodded, touching the plaque gently. The engineers found something else in the tunnel during repairs. Show him, she said to someone behind them. A young engineer stepped forward, holding a dusty old Marshall's radio. It was wedged in one of the support beams, still had a recording on it. He pressed play. Through static, a voice from 20 years ago spoke, "This is Marshall Thompson. If anyone finds this, check support section T7. The vibration pattern is wrong. I've left my calculations. My child will know what to do. Someone will listen." The radio fell silent. He knew, Anna whispered. Somehow, he knew it would take 20 years, knew our child would finish what he started. Above them, work continued on the tunnel. The new sensors blinked green, monitoring every stress point. No tunnel would ever be at risk again. On tracks around the world, similar changes were happening. Marshall Thompson's theories about vibration and structural integrity were revolutionizing track safety. His name was becoming legend in the sport. Lewis's team had created a scholarship in Thompson's honor, funding engineering students who wanted to work in racing safety. The first recipient would be announced next week. The other drivers want to do something too, Lewis told Anna. We're all wearing his Marshall number at the next race. Every car will carry his name. She squeezed his hand. Michael would say that's too much fuss. He was always modest about his work. He saved lives, Lewis said. Both then and now, that deserves some fuss. As they walked away from the tunnel, Lewis glanced back one last time. For just a moment, he thought he saw them. A marshal showing his child how to check the safety sensors, both smiling, both at peace. Then they were gone, leaving only their legacy behind, a legacy of courage, a legacy of safety, a legacy of love. Formula One had changed forever, not because of a crash, not because of a tragedy, but because a marshal cared enough to warn them, because his child was brave enough to act, and because a champion chose to listen. The next race would be different. Every race would be different. But they would be safer. They would be better. All because of a father's love, a child's courage, and a choice to put lives before victory. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments. Sometimes heroes work in silence. Sometimes victory means knowing when to stop. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most important race is the one you choose not to finish. 1 year later, the Monaco paddock was quiet in the early morning light. Lewis walked through the empty garage area, remembering that day a year ago when a young fan had changed everything. He stopped at the new safety center, a glass-walled room filled with monitors showing real-time data from every part of the track. Marshall Thompson's notebook sat in a glass case at the center, opened to his final calculations. "I wondered if you'd come early today." Lewis turned to find Anna Thompson standing in the doorway. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a teenager, about 15 years old, wearing a junior marshal's uniform. "This is Alex," Anna said softly. "Michael's child from his first marriage. The one who warned you last year." Lewis felt his world shift. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "But how?" he asked. "You were so young in the paddock that day." Alex smiled, touching the glass case holding their father's notebook. "I wasn't. You saw what you needed to see. What everyone needed to see. A child carrying their father's warning." "I don't understand," Lewis said. Anna opened her bag and pulled out an old photo album. "Show him, Alex." The teenager opened it to a marked page. There was Marshall Thompson, standing proudly in his marshal's uniform. Beside him was a small child, Alex at age 5, just months before the accident. "Dad used to bring me to the track," Alex explained. "He taught me everything about racing, about safety, about responsibility. When he died, I promised I'd finish his work." "But last year," Lewis started. "Last year I was 14, studying engineering, living with my mom in London. I found Dad's notebook in our attic, spent years learning everything in it, understanding his calculations, when I realized what the date meant." "You came to warn us," Lewis finished. Alex nodded. "But I knew no one would listen to a teenager. They needed to see what Dad saw, a child who cared about safety more than spectacle. So I played a part, made myself look younger, made sure you'd see what you needed to see." "And the figure in the marshal's uniform?" Lewis asked quietly. "That was real," Anna said. "As real as a father's love can be." Alex touched the notebook's glass case again. Dad's calculations were perfect. He knew the exact date the tunnel would become dangerous. Knew it would take someone like you to believe the warning. "But why me?" Lewis asked. "Because of what you wrote to me," Alex said, pulling out an old letter. "After Dad died, you sent this to his family." The letter was worn from being read many times. "Dear Thompson family, your father was a hero who put safety before everything else. One day, I hope to be the kind of champion who would do the same, who would stop a race to save a life. Lewis Hamilton, 2005. "I was just a rookie then," Lewis said softly. "You were the only driver who wrote to us," Alex said. "Dad's last notes said to find someone who would listen, someone who would understand. The letter proved it would be you. The morning sun filtered through the safety center windows, making the monitors glow. On each screen, Thomson Safety Systems showed green, protecting drivers, crews, and fans. "Did you ever tell your mother," Louis asked Anna, "about seeing Michael that day?" She smiled. "I didn't have to. A mother knows when her husband is watching over their children. Both of them." Alex straightened their junior marshal uniform. "I start official training next week. Going to be a safety engineer, just like Dad." "The Thomson legacy continues," Louis said. "It never stopped," Alex replied. "Dad's love, his knowledge, his dedication, it didn't die with him. It just needed the right moment to save lives." They stood together, watching the sun rise over Monaco. Soon the paddock would fill with teams, drivers, and fans. But for now, it belonged to those who understood its deepest truth: that sometimes a father's love spans decades, that sometimes a child's courage changes history, that sometimes the biggest victories come from hearts, not checkered flags. Marshal Thomson had known all along, known his child would finish his work, known Louis would help make it happen, known that love was stronger than death. And as the first cars began arriving for the Monaco Grand Prix, 3 figures stood in the safety center: a champion who chose to listen, a child who chose to act, and a mother who understood it all. The ghost of a marshal smiled from the doorway, then faded into memory. His work was done. His family was safe. His legacy would live forever. Racing had changed. Lives had been saved. Love had won. And somewhere, in every race that followed, a father's pride lived on in his child's courage and in a champion's choice to believe in both. I hope this story kept you on the edge of your seat. Lewis Hamilton's split-second decision that day showed us that sometimes being a champion means more than just winning races. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your country's name in the comments below. Are there any other F1 stories you'd like to hear? Maybe about Senna, Schumacher, or another racing legend? If you enjoyed this story about courage, family, and doing the right thing, don't forget to hit that like button. And make sure to subscribe to our channel. Until next time, remember, sometimes the biggest victories aren't about crossing the finish line first.